I'm Violet. I'm 39. And 3 weeks ago, I walked into my mother's backyard barbecue with the sister she'd buried 40 years ago, wearing the same blue dress from the photograph that had haunted my entire childhood, and I watched my mother's face become a language I finally understood. Not grief, but arithmetic. The calculation of a woman realizing her inventory was wrong. But that's the end, or the closest thing to an end I've found. To understand why I spent 34 years being the understudy in a dead girl's life, why I became a journalist who specialized in digging up other people's graves, why I stood in a cemetery at midnight with a forensic exhumation permit and a flashlight, waiting to discover whether my own sister's coffin was empty, you have to understand the theology of replacement. The way some mothers don't raise children, they raise alibis. I was born 4 years after Elena died, or after Elena was buried. I didn't know then that these were different events, that a funeral could be a transaction, that a tombstone could be a receipt. My mother, Evelyn, told me the story before I could speak. She would hold me in the rocking chair in her bedroom, the one with the creaky left runner that sounded like a heartbeat with arrhythmia, and she would describe the accident. The red car. The intersection on Hawthorne. The driver who ran the light, who was never found, who became a ghost as real to me as Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. Elena was 5. She was wearing her blue dress. She was holding a stuffed rabbit named Mr. Whiskers. She flew through the windshield and landed in a garden of tulips, and by the time the ambulance arrived, she was already an angel. Evelyn cried every time she told it. Not delicate tears. Theatrical, body-shaking sobs that left her mascara streaked in channels down her cheeks. That made her grip my arms hard enough to leave fingerprints I would examine in the mirror later, wondering if they were shaped like wings. "You were born to heal me," she would whisper into my hair, her breath hot and smelling of the Chardonnay she drank from a coffee mug so the neighbors wouldn't know. "You were born because God took Elena and gave me a second chance. You owe her your life, Violet. Every breath you take is borrowed from her." I believed her. Children believe their mothers the way plants believe in sunlight, not as a choice, but as a biological imperative. I grew up in a house that was a museum to a child who wasn't there. Elena's photograph dominated the living room, a 5-year-old with blonde curls and a gap-toothed smile, wearing the blue dress that became the most famous garment in our family's history. Blue like the Virgin Mary. Blue like the sky she supposedly ascended to. Blue like the bruises Evelyn left on my arms when I forgot to mention Elena at Thanksgiving, or when I laughed too loudly at a movie, or when I asked why my birthday cake didn't have candles the year I turned 6 because Evelyn had spent the money on lilies for Elena's grave. There were rules. Unspoken but absolute. I could not wear blue. That was Elena's color. I could not play with stuffed rabbits. That was Elena's totem. I could not turn 5 without a ceremony at the intersection where she died, where Evelyn would lay flowers and weep while I stood in my good dress, holding her hand, feeling the traffic rush past, and wondering if any of these drivers knew they were passing a shrine. I could not ask about the scar on Evelyn's left wrist, the one she called the mark of a mother's love, and which I later recognized as a surgical incision from a tubal ligation performed 6 months after my birth. She had closed the factory. I was the last product. My father, Henry, existed in the house like furniture. He was there, functional, occasionally useful, but never the point of any room. He worked at an insurance company, processing claims, measuring other people's tragedies against actuarial tables. He processed Elena's death the same way, efficiently, quietly, without visible grief. I remember him once when I was 8, finding me crying in the garage after Evelyn had screamed at me for forgetting the words to Amazing Grace at Elena's memorial service. He sat on an overturned bucket and handed me a handkerchief that smelled like motor oil and said, "Your sister was a little girl, Violet. Not a saint. Your mother needs her to be a saint. You don't have to." It was the only time he ever contradicted Evelyn's theology. The next week, he moved into the guest room, and 2 months after that, he moved into an apartment across town. I saw him every other Saturday. He would take me to diners and let me order pancakes for dinner, and he never mentioned Elena once. When he died of a heart attack when I was 16, Evelyn told me he had never recovered from the loss. I knew she meant Elena's loss, not mine. At his funeral, she stood by the casket and told mourners that now both her angels were in heaven. I was standing next to her. Alive, 16, invisible. I left home at 18 with a scholarship to study journalism and a duffel bag of clothes that contained nothing blue. I told myself I was escaping. I told myself I would build a life so far from Evelyn's gravity that I would forget the sound of that rocking chair, the smell of Chardonnay in coffee mugs, the weight of a dead sister's name pressed into my forehead like a brand. I became an investigative reporter. I specialized in the macabre, the hidden, the stories buried under official narratives, fraudulent charities, cemetery scams, identity theft from the dead. I was good at it. I was patient in a way that frightened my editors. I could sit with a file for weeks, months, tracing the thread of a lie through decades of paperwork until the truth emerged like a body from a lake. I married David when I was 28. He was a photographer who documented war zones and refugee camps, a man who understood that some stories could only be told by the wounds they left. We had Sam when I was 29, Lee when I was 32. I was determined to be a different mother. A mother who didn't need her children to be miracles or replacements or debts paid to the dead. A mother who let them wear any color they wanted. But Evelyn was always there. Phone calls on Elena's birthday. Phone calls on the anniversary of the accident. Phone calls on my own birthday where she would say, 34 years ago today, I was in labor with you, thinking about how Elena would have loved a sister. She visited twice a year, staying in our guest room, bringing gifts for Sam and Lee that were always slightly wrong. Too old, too young, too religious, too haunted by the ghost of what Elena would have wanted. And always, always the photograph. The blue dress. The gap-toothed smile. This is your Aunt Elena, she would tell my children, who called her Grandma Evie and tolerated her kisses with the resigned patience of children who know adults are strange but must be humored. She's in heaven now, but she watches over you. I never contradicted her, not directly. I told myself it was harmless. I told myself that Evelyn was old, that her grief was real even if her theology was cruel, that some myths were too heavy to dismantle without crushing the believer. I sent birthday cards. I answered her calls. I performed the role of the grateful second chance, the daughter who understood her own existence as a consolation prize. Then, 6 months ago, I got the assignment. My editor called it a routine follow-up. A series of investigative pieces on private cemeteries and funeral homes accused of burying empty caskets, selling the same plot twice, disposing of bodies improperly to save costs. It was not glamorous work. It involved spreadsheets, exhumation permits, angry phone calls from funeral directors who had lawyers on retainer. I had done 3 similar stories in the past 5 years. I knew the drill. But something made me think of Elena. Something made me wonder, for the first time in 34 years, whether her grave was real. Whether the body in the blue dress was actually there, under the tulips and the lilies and the decades of my mother's performance. I told myself it was professional curiosity. A journalist's instinct to verify. I told myself that if I proved Elena's grave was real, I could finally stop wondering. I could finally believe. I was lying. I was looking for permission to stop believing. The exhumation happened on a Tuesday in March. I paid for it myself, using a private contractor who didn't ask questions, who worked with families who suspected infidelity or insurance fraud, or simply wanted to know if their loved ones were where they were supposed to be. We worked at night. The cemetery was old, the records poorly digitized, the night damp and smelling of turned earth and early spring. I stood under a sodium light that turned everything orange and watched them dig. The coffin was small, white, with brass handles that had tarnished green. I had seen photographs from the funeral, stored in Evelyn's albums. This was the same coffin, I was sure of it. They opened it. Empty, not empty like decayed, not empty like a skeleton collapsed into dust, empty like never used. The interior was pristine, the white satin lining unstained, the pillow smooth and uncreased. On top of the pillow, folded with surgical precision, was a blue dress. The blue dress, the one from the photograph. The one Elena had supposedly died in. I didn't scream. I didn't faint. I stood there in the orange light and I felt something crack inside me, not like a bone but like ice on a lake, the moment before it gives way. I reached into the coffin and I touched the dress. It was real fabric. Cotton, faded at the seams, smelling of cedar and thyme, but there was no body. There had never been a body. I took photographs. I took samples. I closed the coffin and I watched them fill the hole and I drove home in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind moving in directions I had spent my life avoiding. Elena had never died. Elena had never been in that coffin. Elena had been somewhere else for 40 years, breathing, aging, becoming someone else, while I was born into a debt I didn't owe and a grief that wasn't real. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I sat in my home office, surrounded by the tools of my profession: databases, public records requests, encrypted communication channels with sources who trusted me because I had never betrayed them, and I applied them to my own life. I traced Evelyn's financial history through the years before my birth. I found the bank accounts I had never known existed. I found the payment, $35,000, transferred from Evelyn's personal account to a private adoption agency called New Beginnings Family Services on March 14, 1980, 2 weeks after Elena's supposed death. The agency had closed in 1995, its director deceased, its records scattered or destroyed, but the money trail was clear. Elena had not died. Elena had been sold. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Carla who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found, who had located war criminals and missing heirs and children stolen by cults. I gave her everything I had: the birth certificate, the adoption agency name, the photograph, the blue dress which I had taken from the coffin and which sat on my desk like evidence in a case I was building against my own origin story. Carla found her in 6 weeks. Helen Marsh, 44 years old, kindergarten teacher in Ashland, Oregon, married to a man named Robert who worked in forestry. 2 children, a daughter Maya, who was 16, and a son James, who was 12. Helen had been adopted at 5 years old by the Marsh family, who told her that her birth mother had died in childbirth and her father was unknown. She had never searched for her origins. She had never questioned the narrative. She had built a life of normalcy, of small kindnesses, of teaching children to read while I had been learning to mourn her. I contacted her through Carla, a letter first, then a phone call. I told her who I was. I told her what I had found. I sent her the photographs, the coffin, the empty space, the blue dress, the bank transfer. She called me back 3 days later. Her voice was not angry, it was broken. It was the voice of someone who had been told a story her entire life and was now being shown the footnotes that contradicted every page. "She's alive?" Helen asked. "Evelyn, our mother, she's alive." "Yes," I said. "And she told you I was dead. For 40 years. Helen was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I want to meet her. Not to forgive her, to see her face when she sees mine." I understood. I had spent my career documenting the moment when liars were confronted with their lies. It was not about vengeance. It was about verification. About forcing someone to acknowledge that the world they had constructed was not the world that existed. We planned it together. Helen and I, sisters who had never met, who had been separated by a transaction and a mythology, who spoke on the phone for hours about our childhoods, hers of suburban normalcy, mine of ghost worship, and discovered we had the same laugh, the same habit of tapping our fingers when anxious, the same mole on our left shoulder, the one Evelyn had called Elena's mark and which I had resented as a brand of the chosen one. Evelyn was turning 70. She had planned a backyard barbecue, intimate, she told me on the phone, just my closest friends from church and the garden club. She wanted me to come. She wanted Sam and Lee to come. She wanted to tell the story of Elena one more time to an audience who had heard it for decades and still responded with the appropriate tears. I told her I would be there. I told her I was bringing a friend. The day was warm for October. The backyard looked exactly as it had in my childhood, the same hydrangeas, the same stone path, the same wooden fence that needed painting. Evelyn had set up a long table with a white tablecloth and paper plates printed with autumn leaves. She wore a blue cardigan, Elena's color, always Elena's color, and she moved through her guests with the grace of a woman who had been receiving sympathy for 40 years and had perfected the choreography of grief. I arrived at 6. Helen was in the car, waiting. I had bought her a dress. Blue. The same shade as the one in the photograph, the one in the coffin, the one that had haunted my childhood. She had resisted at first. "I don't want to be her ghost," she said. "I want to be me." "You are you," I told her. "The dress is just a costume. She'll see you in it and she'll understand that her myth is over." Helen looked at me with eyes that were the same gray-green as mine, the same as Evelyn's, the same as the photograph on the living room wall. "What do you want from this, Violet?" "I want her to see what she threw away," I said. "And I want her to see what she got instead." We walked through the side gate. The guests were gathered on the patio, holding plastic cups of wine, listening to Evelyn tell a story about Elena's first day of kindergarten. "She was so brave," Evelyn was saying, her voice carrying that particular tremolo she used for climaxes. "She didn't cry, not once. She just walked into that classroom like she owned it. And then, 4 months later, she was gone." I cleared my throat. Evelyn turned. Her face lit up with the performance of maternal joy, the expression she wore for cameras and congregations. "Violet, and you brought," she stopped. The light in her face didn't fade, it shattered. Like a bulb hitting concrete, the filament breaking, the darkness immediate and absolute. Helen stepped forward. She was not smiling. She was not crying. She was simply present in the flesh in the blue dress, with the same gray-green eyes and the same mole, and the same gap-toothed smile from the photograph that had dominated this woman's life. "Hello, Mama," Helen said. Her voice was steady. "I had never been prouder of anyone in my life. I heard you were having a party. I thought I'd come back from the dead for it." The guests froze. Mrs. Henderson from the garden club dropped her wine cup. Pastor Mike, who had officiated at Elena's memorial service and my father's funeral, took a step backward as if the ground had shifted. Evelyn's mouth opened, closed, opened again. This is some kind of joke. Violet, what have you done? Who is this woman?" I walked to the table. I took the folder from my bag, the same bag I used for press conferences and courthouse steps, and I opened it. I spread the photographs across the white tablecloth over the paper plates and the potato salad. The coffin, the empty space, the blue dress on the satin pillow, the bank transfer, the adoption agency records, the photograph of Helen Marsh, age 5, in the arms of her new parents, 2 weeks after her supposed death. "Her name is Elena," I said. "Or it was. You sold her for $35,000 to a private adoption agency. You told everyone she died in a car accident. You built a life on her grave, and you made me, the replacement child, spend my entire life thanking her for a death that never happened." Evelyn looked at the photographs. She looked at Helen. She looked at me, and for the first time in my life I saw her without the mask. Not grief, not saintliness, not the trembling lip of a mother who had lost everything. I saw calculation. I saw panic. I saw a woman who had spent 40 years managing an inventory and was now confronted with a product she had written off. "This is insane," Evelyn whispered. But her voice was not strong. It was the voice of someone who had been speaking from a script and had just been handed pages from a different play. "Is it?" Helen asked. She walked closer, close enough to touch. Close enough that Evelyn could smell her perfume, see the gray in her hair, count the lines around her eyes that matched her own. "I grew up in Oregon, Mama. I had a mother who loved me, a father who taught me to ride a bike. I have children of my own, and I never knew you existed. I never knew I had a sister. I never knew I was supposed to be dead." She reached out and took Evelyn's hand. Evelyn flinched, but Helen held on. "I don't want your money. I don't want your tears. I want you to look at me and tell me why you gave me away, why you told my sister I was dead, why you built a church on a grave that was empty." Evelyn pulled her hand away. She looked around at her guests, her congregation, her audience of 40 years. They were not crying. They were not reaching for their checkbooks. They were staring at her with expressions she had never seen before. Not sympathy, recognition. The recognition of people who had been told a story and were now watching it unravel in real time. "I was young," Evelyn said. Her voice was different now. Smaller, the tremolo gone, replaced by something flat and desperate. "I was 25. I had a child I didn't want. A husband who wouldn't leave. And then I met someone who told me about the agency. They said it was better for everyone, that Elena would have a better life, that I could start over." "So you sold her," I said. "I gave her a chance. You sold her," I repeated. "And then you bought a new life with the money. And when you got pregnant with me, you realized you could use her again, not as a daughter, as a foundation, a myth, a reason for people to love you." Evelyn looked at the photographs on the table. She reached for the one of the empty coffin, her fingers trembling. "I kept the dress," she whispered. I thought if I kept something, it would be like keeping her." "You kept the dress because it was evidence you couldn't destroy," Helen said. "You put it in the coffin because you thought no one would ever look. And you were right. For 40 years you were right, until your other daughter decided to stop believing you." Pastor Mike stepped forward. He was pale, his hands shaking. "Evelyn," he said, "is this true? Did you take donations for Elena's memorial fund? Did you use that money?" Evelyn didn't answer. She was looking at Helen with an expression I had never seen before. Not love, not guilt, something like hunger. The hunger of a woman who had spent 40 years worshipping a ghost and was now being offered the real thing, warm and breathing and angry. "You're my daughter," Evelyn said to Helen. You came back to me." Helen laughed. It was not a happy sound. "I came back to see your face when you realized your ghost could talk. I came back to tell you that you don't get to own me, not in death, not in life. And I came back to tell Violet," she turned to me, her eyes wet but her voice steady, "that she doesn't owe you anything, not her childhood, not her grief, not her life." I felt something break in me then, not the ice I had expected, but a wall I had built so long ago I had forgotten it was construction. The wall that said I had to be grateful, that I had to perform, that my existence was a debt I could never fully repay. Helen was looking at me with eyes that knew, that had survived their own erasure, that understood what it meant to be a story someone else told. I know, I said, and for the first time in 39 years, I believed it. We left Evelyn standing in her backyard, surrounded by her guests and her photographs, and her 40 years of carefully constructed grief. Pastor Mike was on his phone, I later learned, calling the bishop. Mrs. Henderson was gathering her things, her face set in the expression of a woman who had just realized she had been funding a fraud for decades. The other guests were leaving, quietly in pairs, not looking back at the woman they had called a saint. Helen and I walked to my car. She took off the blue dress in the back seat, pulling a sweater and jeans from her bag, changing with the efficiency of someone who had spent her life being practical. I don't want to be Elena anymore, she said. I never was Elena, I was always Helen, she was your ghost, not mine. I know, I said again. The words were becoming easier. We drove to my house. David was waiting with Sam and Lee, who had been told that Aunt Helen was coming to visit, that she was a surprise. That family was sometimes stranger and better than we expected. They took to her immediately. Sam showed her his rock collection. Lee made her draw a family tree that included branches we were still discovering. That night, after the children were asleep, Helen and I sat on my porch with wine in coffee mugs, because some habits are too deep to unlearn. We didn't talk about Evelyn. We talked about our childhoods, hers of Oregon rain and bicycle lessons, mine of cemetery visits and performance. We talked about our children, our fears, our moles. We talked until the wine was gone and the crickets were loud and the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. I want to see her again, Helen said suddenly. Not Evelyn, the grave, the empty space. I want to stand there and know that I'm not buried anymore. We went the next morning. The cemetery was different in daylight, smaller, less ominous. The tulips were blooming, early and bright, planted by Evelyn or the groundskeeper or some other mourner of a fiction. We stood at the headstone, Elena Brennan, beloved daughter, 1975 to 1980, and we held hands and we didn't cry. We planted new flowers. Real ones. Lilies for the living, not the dead. I published the story 3 weeks later, not as a journalist, though I used my skills. As a sister. As a survivor of a mythology that had nearly consumed me. The response was overwhelming. Other families came forward with similar stories, other empty graves, other children sold and mourned and replaced. Evelyn faced charges of fraud, of illegal adoption practices, of embezzlement from the memorial fund that had never existed. But the real punishment was simpler. She became irrelevant. The ghost she had built her life around walked out of her backyard and never looked back. Helen visits monthly now. She and Robert are considering moving closer. Meyer and James call me Aunt Violet in the tentative way of people still learning a language. Sam and Lee have 2 cousins they didn't know existed, and a grandmother they will never see again, and a family that is being built not on mythology but on choice. I still have the blue dress. I didn't return it to the coffin. I keep it in a box in my closet, not as a relic but as evidence. Proof that stories can be unmade, that graves can be empty, that the debt you were told you owed was never real. I learned to swim last month. At 39, in the municipal pool with Helen cheering from the edge and Lee holding my hand in the shallow end. The water was cold and chemical-smelling, and nothing like the warm bath I had been taught to fear. I put my face in and I opened my eyes and I saw the tiles below, blue and white and real, and I breathed out bubbles and I didn't drown. That's my story. If someone ever sold you as a replacement, if someone ever made you grateful for a life that was framed as debt, if someone ever told you that your existence was borrowed from the dead, hear me. You don't owe them your breath. You don't owe them your performance. You don't owe them your children's belief in ghosts that were never real. You are not the second chance. You are not the consolation prize. You are not the understudy waiting for the star to return. You are the star. You were always the star, and the stage is yours.